The Nintendo 64 was home to some of the very best games of that particular generation. Fans of most genres were well catered to. First-person shooters, action RPGs, platformers, you name it. But many fans at the time were also asking, where were all the fighting games? After all, one of the defining releases for the Super Nintendo was its brilliant port of Street Fighter II. So how could the long-awaited follow-up console not have its own stable of fantastic one-on-one fighters to continue the tradition? The popularity of fighting games, and 3D fighters in particular, had exploded in the years following, and many companies were cashing in big time. In an era where arcades and rival consoles were drowning in the likes of Virtua Fighter, Tekken, and Dead or Alive, the Nintendo 64 was forced to try and compete, with titles that ranged from being fun but niche, to bland and forgettable, to downright despicable. Despite some interesting elements,
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream
was certainly not going to draw players away from the other juggernauts of the genre.
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream
stands for Generation of Arts, Speed, and Power. It's a game that feels deeply rooted in anime culture, from the artwork, to the voices, to the characters themselves. It certainly feels like it was all conceived as part of a wider franchise that never quite made it. The character designs are certainly a mixed bag, with a couple of interesting ones offset by some truly bizarre choices. I'd love to know where the inspiration for this character came from. It's as if someone took a bunch of physical characteristics and costume ideas, cut them into pieces, threw them on the ground, and then put them back together again in a different order. The gameplay itself seems inoffensive to start, though totally forgettable. It uses a relatively simple control scheme that shouldn't overwhelm the slightly odd Nintendo 64 controller. Similar to games like Virtua Fighter, you have buttons for punch, kick, block, and in this case, evade. This allows you to take advantage of the 3D arenas, which have details and obstacles designed to make them feel like real environments rather than simple rings. Unfortunately, most of these details are superfluous at best, and are mostly just frustrating due to their placement, often finding their way in front of the camera, or simply being difficult to identify in the moment. The fighting engine itself is quite basic, with only a rudimentary combo system, and little to differentiate itself from the competition in any meaningful way. Visually, the game was already dated on release, as was noted by reviews at the time. It's not all bad. The frame rate is okay, and the game can appear decently colourful at times, if you aren't looking too closely. The detail is terrible though, with some shocking textures, and simplistic models that simply don't convey the characters well at all. It's a bad sign, particularly when there are only 8 characters to choose from in the first place. However, this all pales in comparison to the issues with the animation. There is a choppiness to the animation that is completely at odds with the comparatively smooth average frame rate, and it makes the game feel off. It's hard to identify the reason at first, but as you play, it becomes more and more apparent that the animations for the various moves flow very poorly from one into the next. This means that you will often see characters snapping from an action back into their idle stance, or travelling further across the screen than the move's animation would indicate. It gives the game an uneven feel that is hard to ignore. To understand how painfully behind the times
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream
actually was visually, let's compare it to something else from a rival console, Tekken 3 on the PlayStation. Let's ignore the vastly superior art direction in Namco's game, and focus more on the technical side. Compare the detail in the textures and the quality of the models in Tekken 3. Look at the way the animation smoothly flows from one move to another. Compare this to
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream,
and the gulf between the games is incredibly obvious. Here's the scary part. The port of Tekken 3 to the PlayStation came out at the same time as
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream
in 1998, and completely crushed it in every aspect. Given the relative power of the Nintendo 64 hardware, there was no excuse for
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream.
to look as antiquated as it did. The other painful aspect of the fights is the camera, which somehow manages to be too slow and too fast, all at the same time. It will often change position to try and make certain moves look more cinematic, but all it really manages to do is disorient the player and break up the flow of the fight. It will also swing around with wild abandon, meaning that you will be on the left-hand side of the screen 1 minute, then with a rapid change in camera, you will suddenly be on the opposite side of the screen. It makes precision very difficult to accomplish, and button mashing often ends up being the most efficient way to play instead. Not really a good look for a 3D fighter, particularly when the competition had essentially solved this issue years beforehand. The audio fares a little better. The voices for characters and the announcer are clear, with some of them actually sounding pretty good and suiting their characters well. The music is also not terrible, with inoffensive tunes that feel like they could have been ripped from a Ridge Racer menu in an alternate universe. Some of the tracks are a bit low energy for a fighting game, but compared to the rest of the game's presentation, they are still worlds better than they could have been. The most interesting part of the game is the option to create your own fighter. There are a decent amount of options, and you can save your created character to a memory card. It's a great feature that was very uncommon in fighting games at the time. Overall,
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream.
actually has significantly more modes and options than you might expect in a fighter of this era, including a tag mode that would be great fun, if only it were in a better game. Even on a system as bereft of 3D fighters as the Nintendo 64,
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream.
had no hope of finding a following with such insipid gameplay and forgettable presentation. Somehow, the game was made even blander when it was released in America and Canada, where the name was changed to the incredibly dreary Deadly Arts. This title was a massive missed opportunity for Konami, who had a chance to corner the 3D fighting game market on Nintendo's flagship console. Instead,
G.A.S.P. Fighters NEXTream.
ended up being a choppy, sloppy, disappointing title by a developer who really should have known better.